The sky over Bremen was the color of iron and ash. December 20th, 1943. 21,000 feet above Nazi Germany, the air itself seemed to scream. The roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines thundered through the fuselage of the B-17 Flying Fortress, a sound so loud it ceased to be noise and became a physical presence, a vibration that rattled teeth, shook bones, turned blood to static. Inside the bomber nicknamed "Ye Old Pub," Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown gripped the control yoke with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, no matter how hard he commanded them to be still. This was his first mission as a pilot in command. 21 years old. Brown hair already turning gray at the temples from stress he didn't yet understand. Eyes the color of a Kansas wheat field, now bloodshot from altitude and fear. He'd trained for this. Thousands of hours in simulators, in training flights over the flat expanses of Texas, learning to coax a 10-ton machine through hostile skies. But nothing, no instructor, no manual, no amount of preparation, could have readied him for this. The flak started as they approached the target. Black flowers blooming in the sky. Each burst of anti-aircraft fire was a steel rose with petals of shrapnel, and they opened everywhere, above, below, beside. The concussions rocked the bomber like a toy in an angry child's hand. Brown's co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Spence, Luke, white-knuckled the throttle levers, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. "Flak at 10 o'clock!" Someone shouted over the intercom, maybe Jenkins, the waist gunner, or maybe Blackie, the engineer. The voices blurred together into a chorus of barely controlled panic. The bomber formation, 36 B-17s that had left England that morning in perfect geometric precision, was already fragmenting. Brown watched 2 flying fortresses ahead of him take direct hits. One simply exploded, a flash of orange and red that left only falling debris and black smoke. The other began a slow, sickening spiral toward the earth, trailing fire like a dying comet. No parachutes. 10 men in each plane. 20 men gone in the space of a heartbeat. Brown's throat closed. He forced himself to breathe. "Bombardier, how long to target?" His voice cracked on the intercom, and he hated himself for it. 2 minutes, skipper. 2 minutes and we're over the plant. The Focke-Wulf factory. That's what they'd come to destroy. Rows of industrial buildings where the Germans built the fighters that killed his friends, that tore apart the bomber formations, that made the sky a graveyard. Intelligence said this was a critical target. Intelligence said the loss rate would be acceptable. Intelligence wasn't up here watching men burn. The bomb bay doors groaned open, and the drag immediately changed the bomber's handling. Brown fought the yoke as the aircraft wanted to nose up, to stall, to fall. His arms burned with the effort of keeping her level. Through the plexiglass, he could see the target now, gray buildings clustered beside a river, smoke already rising from earlier hits. The whole formation was converging on this single point, and the Germans knew it. The flak intensified until the sky looked like someone had thrown ink across a canvas. "Bombs away!" The fortress lurched upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosive dropped free, and for one glorious second Brown allowed himself to believe they might make it home. The formation was already banking away, turning northwest toward the North Sea and England beyond. All he had to do was follow. All he had to do was. The Messerschmitt came out of the sun. Brown never saw it. Never heard it. One moment the sky was clear, and the next the entire world was cannon fire and screaming metal. The Bf-109 flashed past so close Brown could see the pilot's face, or the oxygen mask that hid it, and then it was gone, climbing vertical into the pale winter sky. But it had done its work. The No. 3 engine exploded in a geyser of flame and black smoke. Shrapnel tore through the thin aluminum skin of the bomber like tissue paper. The right wing was suddenly full of holes, daylight streaming through, hydraulic fluid spraying in pink mist. The tail gunner, Frenchy, young kid from Louisiana with a smile that could light up a room, stopped responding on the intercom. "Frenchy! Frenchy, talk to me!" Brown shouted, but there was only static. More fighters. The Bf-109 had brought friends, and they swarmed the crippled bomber like sharks drawn to blood. The guns chattered, the top turret, the waist guns, the ball turret beneath, filling the air with brass casings that rolled and bounced across the deck. The smell of cordite and hot metal overwhelmed everything. "I'm hit! Jesus Christ, I'm hit!" That was Blackie, voice rising to a scream. "Engine 4's on fire! Lost hydraulics! Oxygen systems gone!" The voices overlapped, a cascade of disaster, and Brown's mind struggled to process it all. Training said to stay calm? Training said to assess and prioritize? But training hadn't prepared him for this, for the reality of command, where every decision meant the difference between men living or dying, and there was no time to think, just react, just survive. He feathered Engine 3, shut down Engine 4, pushed the remaining 2 engines to maximum power. The bomber shook like a dying animal. The airspeed was dropping. They were falling behind the formation, and falling behind meant death. The fighters always picked off the stragglers. Another pass. Cannon shells walked across the nose, shattering the plexiglass, and suddenly the cockpit was full of wind that felt like frozen knives. Brown's face went numb. Ice crystals formed on his oxygen mask. Beside him, Spence had blood running down his face from where a fragment of something, metal or glass, impossible to tell, had opened his forehead. "Spence! I'm okay. But his voice was weak, thready, the voice of a man going into shock. The formation was gone. Disappeared into the gray distance, already 10 miles ahead and pulling away. Ye old pub was alone, a wounded animal separated from the herd, and every predator in the sky knew it. Brown pushed the nose down, trading altitude for airspeed, but it wasn't enough. The bomber wallowed through the air like a wounded whale, bleeding hydraulic fluid and fuel, leaving a trail of smoke that any fighter could follow from miles away. Below, Germany stretched out, a patchwork of white fields and dark forests, roads like veins, towns clustered around church steeples. Enemy territory. Every square mile of it. The intercom crackled. "Pilot, this is Navigator. We've got major damage back here. The whole tail section is shot to hell. I can see through to the outside in 3 places." That was Eckholz, the navigator, his voice remarkably steady considering. The man was from Minnesota, had that Scandinavian stoicism that never quite showed panic even when panic was the only rational response. "Can you plot us a course home?" Brown asked. "Working on it, Skipper. But we're way off course. The formation turned without us. Just get me a heading. Anything north." "Roger that." Brown checked his instruments. Oil pressure dropping on Engine 1. Engine 2 running hot, temperature gauge creeping into the red. Airspeed 140, should be 160. Altitude 18,000 and falling. They were dying by degrees, the bomber giving up piece by piece. Behind him, he could hear the crew moving around. Someone was crying, high, breathless sobs that cut through even the engine noise. Someone else was praying in Spanish, a rapid-fire litany that Brown recognized as the Rosary even though he didn't speak the language. That would be Ramirez, the ball turret gunner, a kid from Arizona who'd told Brown once that his mother made him promise to say the Rosary every day, even in combat. "Skipper, this is top turret." That was Hugh Eckenrode, the flight engineer, his voice tight with pain. "Blackie's hurt bad. Real bad. He's got shrapnel in his shoulder and his leg. I'm trying to stop the bleeding, but—" "Do what you can," Brown said, because what else could he say? There was no doctor up here. No medic. Just young men with basic first aid training trying to keep each other alive with whatever they could find. The tail gunner still wasn't responding. Brown made himself not think about what that meant. More altitude gone. 16,000 feet now. The air was getting thicker, easier to breathe even through the damaged oxygen system, but that was small comfort. Lower meant easier for the flak batteries. Lower meant the fighters could dive on them with even more speed. "Pilot, I've got a heading for you," Eckholz said. 310. That should take us to the coast, then across the North Sea to England. How far? To the coast? Maybe 200 miles. To England, 400, give or take. 400 miles. In a bomber that was barely flying. With 2 engines, maybe 1.5. Brown did the math in his head. At their current speed, that was almost 3 hours. 3 hours over enemy territory, over hostile water, in a plane that might fall apart at any moment. They'd never make it. But what choice did they have? Roger, navigator. Heading 310. Brown turned the yoke gently, afraid to bank too hard, afraid the damaged wing would simply fold up. The bomber responded sluggishly, like steering a ship through mud, but she turned. Slowly. Painfully. But she turned. The minutes crawled past. Brown's arms ached from the constant pressure on the yoke. The trim system was damaged, and the aircraft wanted to drop her nose and dive. Every moment was a fight to keep her level. His hands were so cold he couldn't feel his fingers anymore. The wind through the shattered nose was like standing in a hurricane, and his flight suit, heavy leather and wool, might as well have been tissue paper. Spence sat beside him, one hand pressed to his forehead where the blood had finally stopped flowing. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. Shock. Definitely shock. But he was still there, still alive, and that counted for something. "You okay?" Brown asked, shouting over the wind. Spence nodded. Tried to smile. It came out as more of a grimace. "Been better. Been worse, too." "When were you worse than this?" "My wedding night. Wife's father got drunk and tried to fight me." Despite everything, despite the fear and the pain and the almost certain knowledge that they were all going to die, Brown laughed. It came out as more of a bark, half hysterical, but it was something. "Did you win?" "Hell no. He was a boxer. I just ran." They flew on. 14,000 feet. 12,000. The bomber kept settling, kept falling, and there was nothing Brown could do about it. Engine 2 was cooking now, temperature gauge deep in the red, and he knew it was only a matter of time before it seized or caught fire or simply exploded. Below, the landscape scrolled past. Villages. Farms. A frozen river that snaked through a valley. Roads with tiny vehicles crawling along them, probably military convoys, heading to or from the front. Somewhere down there were people living their lives, eating breakfast, going to work, having no idea that 10,000 feet above them was a bomber full of boys waiting to die. "Fighters!" The call came from the top turret, and Brown's heart dropped into his stomach. Not now. Not when they were so close to the coast. Please God, not now. But there they were. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s, coming in from 4 o'clock high, their yellow noses bright against the gray sky. They'd have seen the smoke trail. Followed it right to the source. And now they were here to finish the job. The guns opened up, what guns were left. The top turret swiveled, tracers streaming out in long red arcs. The waist guns hammered. But the fighters were fast, so fast, and they split apart and dove, and the world became cannon fire again. The hits walked up the fuselage. Metal screamed. Something exploded in the waist section, a bright flash and a gout of smoke, and someone started screaming. Not words. Just screaming. One of the fighters flashed past the nose, so close Brown could see the pilot's face, or the leather helmet and goggles, at least, and then it was climbing away, looping back for another pass. "We can't take much more of this!" Spence shouted. Brown knew. The bomber was hanging together by will and prayer, and both were running out. The Focke-Wulfs came around again. This time they didn't split up. They came in together, line abreast, and their cannons fired in perfect unison. The impacts marched across the wings, the fuselage, the tail. The right landing gear exploded, parts spinning away into the void. Engine 1 coughed, sputtered, died. One engine left. The bomber nosed down, and Brown hauled back on the yoke with everything he had. The muscles in his arms screamed. His back felt like someone was driving hot nails into his spine. But slowly, agonizingly, the nose came up. Level flight. Barely. The fighters were coming around again. Brown could see them setting up for the kill shot, lining up perfectly, and there was nothing he could do. The guns had stopped firing, out of ammo, or jammed, or the gunners were dead. He didn't know which, and it didn't matter. This was the end. He thought of his mother, his father, his kid sister who'd cried at the train station when he left for training. He thought of the girl he'd been dating before the war, Mary, with the red hair and the laugh like music. He wondered if she'd remember him. If anyone would remember him. The fighters opened fire. And then something impossible happened. Another fighter appeared. It came out of nowhere, dropping out of the clouds above, and it wasn't a Focke-Wulf. It was a Messerschmitt Bf-109, and it was diving on the two attacking fighters with its guns blazing. Tracers streamed past. One of the Focke-Wulfs broke off immediately, banking hard left and running for the deck. The other tried to turn into the attack, but the Bf-109 was already there, cutting inside the turn, and its cannons fired a single burst. The Focke-Wulf came apart. Just disintegrated. One moment it was there, the next it was falling debris and black smoke. The remaining Focke-Wulf didn't wait to see more. It dove away, streaking for the horizon at full throttle. And the Bf-109 slid in beside the bomber. Brown stared. His mind refused to process what he was seeing. A German fighter. Right there. 50 yards away. Close enough that he could see the pilot's head turning, looking at them. The fighter's yellow nose cone. The black cross on the fuselage. The slim, deadly wings. But it wasn't attacking. It was just flying there. Matching speed. Parallel. What the hell? Spence whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. The Bf-109 moved closer. 40 yards. 30. Close enough that Brown could see details now. The oil stains on the cowling, the patches where battle damage had been repaired, the number 2 painted in white behind the cockpit. The pilot was looking directly at them, his face hidden behind oxygen mask and goggles. Brown's hands were frozen on the yoke. Every instinct screamed that this was a trick, a trap, that any second the fighter would open fire, and that would be that. But it didn't fire. It just flew there, steady and calm, like they were on a training mission instead of over hostile territory. The bomber lurched. Engine 2 was failing now, coughing and sputtering, and Brown's altitude was bleeding away fast. 8,000 feet. 7,000. He was losing her. The Bf-109 moved ahead slightly, then pulled back level. The pilot raised one hand from his stick and pointed down. Then he made a circling motion with his hand palm down. Land? He was telling them to land. Brown shook his head. Pointed northwest. England. Home. The German pilot seemed to consider this for a long moment. Then, incredibly, he nodded. And he stayed with them. Brown couldn't understand it. Couldn't process it. This was the enemy. This was a man who'd probably killed dozens of Allied pilots. Who should be killing them right now? But instead he was, what? Protecting them? The intercom crackled. Skipper, is that a German fighter? Eckholz, the navigator, his voice filled with disbelief. Yeah. Is he attacking us? No. Then what the hell is he doing? I have no idea. They flew on. The bomber continued to die by degrees, losing altitude, losing airspeed, losing the fight against gravity and damage and time. But the Bf-109 stayed with them, matching every shudder, every lurch, every desperate attempt to stay airborne. Below, Brown saw a flak battery. 4 88mm guns pointed at the sky, their crews probably tracking the bomber right now, calculating range and elevation. He tensed, waiting for the black bursts to start appearing around them. But the Bf-109 moved in closer. Almost wingtip to wingtip now. And Brown realized what the German pilot was doing. He was making it clear to the gunners below that this wasn't a combat situation. This bomber was under escort. Was being taken prisoner. Don't fire. The flak guns stayed silent. Minutes passed. Each one felt like an hour. The bomber's last engine was running rough now, missing on at least 2 cylinders, the whole aircraft shaking with the uneven rhythm. Brown could feel it in his bones, in his teeth. This engine was going to die. It was only a question of when. But they kept flying. Kept limping north. And the German pilot stayed with them, a guardian angel in the form of their worst nightmare. They crossed the river, the Weser, Brown thought, though he couldn't be sure. Beyond it, the terrain changed. Fewer towns. More forests. And in the distance, through the haze, he could see it, a thin dark line on the horizon that marked the North Sea. The coast. If they could just make it that far. If they could just get over the water, the German flak would stop and fighters would turn back. They'd have a chance. The Bf-109 waggled its wings. Brown had no idea what that meant. Was it a signal? A warning? But then the fighter moved ahead again, pulling slightly up, and Brown understood. The pilot was clearing the way, showing that the bomber wasn't a threat, making sure no trigger-happy gun crew decided to take a shot. They reached the coast at 4,000 feet. Brown could see the waves now, dark gray and white-capped, stretching to the horizon. Beyond that, somewhere in the mist and distance, was England. Was home. Was safety. The Bf-109 slowed, falling back level with the bomber again. And then the pilot did something that Brown would remember for the rest of his life. He looked directly at Brown through the shattered cockpit glass. Even through the oxygen mask and goggles, Brown could see his eyes. And then, slowly, deliberately, the German pilot raised his hand. Not pointing. Not signaling. Just raising his hand. Palm out. A wave. A gesture of farewell. Of respect. Brown's throat closed. His eyes burned with tears that had nothing to do with the freezing wind. Slowly, not quite believing what he was doing, he released the yoke with his right hand. It was the first time he'd let go since the attack started, and the bomber immediately tried to nose down, but Spence grabbed his yoke and held it steady. Brown raised his hand. Held it there. Across 50 yards of sky, two pilots, enemies, warriors, men who should have been trying to kill each other, shared a moment of connection that transcended war and nation and ideology. The German pilot held the wave for 3 heartbeats. Then his hand moved to his forehead, and he gave a salute. Sharp. Precise. Military. But there was something else in it too. Something that looked like sorrow. Or maybe respect. Or maybe just acknowledgement that they were both caught in the same insane machine, both trying to survive, both just men doing terrible jobs in a terrible war. Brown returned the salute. His hand was shaking. His whole body was shaking. But he held the salute until the German pilot nodded once and then banked away, the Bf-109 peeling off to the right and climbing into the clouds. Brown watched him go. Watched until the fighter was just a dark speck against the gray, then nothing at all. Gone. Jesus Christ, Spence whispered. Did that just happen? Brown didn't answer. He couldn't. His hand was back on the yoke and he was fighting to keep the bomber level, fighting to gain altitude, fighting to make it across the water. But part of his mind was still back there, in that moment, meeting the eyes of a man who should have killed him but chose mercy instead. The bomber limped over the North Sea. Engine 2 died 10 minutes from the coast, and Brown was flying on nothing but momentum and prayer. The wings were full of holes. The hydraulics were gone. The electrical system was failing. But they were over the water now, and that meant safety. That meant survival. Navigator, how far to England? Brown asked. 150 miles, skipper. Straight shot. 150 miles. It might as well have been 1,000. The bomber was falling out of the sky, losing altitude with every passing minute. 2,000 feet. 1,500. 1,000. The waves were getting closer, and Brown could see the white caps now, could imagine the cold water waiting to swallow them. Everybody in crash positions, he ordered. We might have to ditch. The crew scrambled. Those who could move helped those who couldn't. Brown heard someone, maybe Jenkins, maybe Ramirez, talking softly to one of the wounded men, reassuring him, lying to him, telling him it was going to be okay. 500 feet. The waves looked huge now, mountains of water rising and falling. If they hit those swells wrong, The bomber would cartwheel and break apart, and they'd all be dead in seconds. But then, land. A dark smudge on the horizon that resolved into cliffs, then beaches, then green fields. England. Impossible, miraculous England. Hold on! Brown shouted. He brought the bomber in low, barely clearing the cliffs, the belly almost brushing the grass. There was no landing gear. It had been shot away hours ago. No flaps. No hydraulics. Just a metal tube falling out of the sky at 100 miles an hour. Brown saw an airfield ahead, some coastal RAF base he didn't recognize. He aimed for the grass beside the runway, not trusting the damaged airframe to take the harder surface. Brace! 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 They hit. The bomber plowed into the grass belly first, throwing up huge plumes of dirt and debris. Metal screamed. Something exploded, probably a tire or hydraulic line. The world became noise and violence, and the sensation of being inside a car accident that lasted forever. Then stillness. Brown sat in his seat, unable to move. His hands were still locked on the yoke even though there was nothing left to control. Beside him, Spence was slumped forward, unconscious or dead, Brown couldn't tell. Behind them, someone was groaning. But they were down. They were in England. They were alive. The ground crew pulled them out through the shattered nose, climbing up on the crumpled fuselage and hauling the crew members out one by one. Ambulances arrived, their bells clanging. Medics swarmed over the wounded. Someone wrapped a blanket around Brown's shoulders and tried to lead him away, but he couldn't move. He stood there, staring at what was left of the old pub. The bomber looked like it had been through a shredder. The entire nose was gone. The tail was barely attached. One wing had more holes than metal. Both landing gear were destroyed. All 4 engines were shot, burned, or simply missing pieces. Hydraulic fluid and oil and fuel had mixed on the ground beneath the wreck, forming dark pools that reflected the gray English sky. The maintenance chief walked around the bomber 3 times, his face growing more disbelieving with each circuit. Finally, he turned to Brown. "Son, I've been working on aircraft for 15 years. I don't know how you got this bird home. She shouldn't fly. Hell, she shouldn't even hold together on the ground. This is—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "This is a miracle." Brown opened his mouth to tell him about the German pilot. About the Bf-109 that had protected them, escorted them, saved them. But the words wouldn't come. How could he explain something he didn't understand himself? Later, in the debriefing, he tried. The intelligence officer, a major with tired eyes and 3 days' stubble, listened to Brown's account of the mission. The attack. The damage. The desperate flight home. He wrote it all down in his notebook, nodding occasionally. Then Brown mentioned the Bf-109. The major's pen stopped moving. He looked up. "Say that again?" "There was a German fighter. A Messerschmitt. He protected us from the other fighters, escorted us to the coast. Lieutenant Brown," the major interrupted gently. "You and your crew have been through hell. Nobody's questioning your courage or your ability. But let's stick to the facts in the official report, shall we?" "These are the facts, sir. There was a German pilot who—" "Lieutenant." The major's voice was firmer now. "Do you understand what you're saying? You're claiming that a German fighter pilot not only didn't attack a damaged bomber, which would be a violation of his duty, but actually protected it from other German aircraft. Do you realize how that sounds?" Brown stared at him. Yes. He realized exactly how it sounded. It sounded insane. It sounded impossible. It sounded like the fantasy of a man whose nerves had been stretched to breaking. But it had happened. He'd seen it. He'd been there. "Yes, sir," Brown said quietly. "I understand." The major sighed. "Look, you brought your crew home against impossible odds. That's what matters. That's what goes in the report. As for this German fighter, let's just say it was confusion. Combat stress. These things happen. Nobody's going to hold it against you. But that's all, Lieutenant." Dismissed. Brown left the debriefing room feeling hollowed out. He found his crew in the hospital, Spence with stitches in his forehead, Blackie with his arm in a sling and bandages around his leg, Eckenrode with cracked ribs. Frenchie wasn't there. Frenchie would never be anywhere again. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar barracks, Brown stared at the ceiling and replayed the mission in his mind. Every moment. Every detail. And most of all, that instant when the German pilot had looked at him across 50 yards of sky and raised his hand in farewell. Who was he? What was his name? Why had he done it? Brown would never know. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, as he flew more missions and watched more friends die and felt the war grinding away at his soul piece by piece, that moment became almost dreamlike. Unreal. Something that might have been imagination or stress or a hallucination brought on by altitude and fear. But it had been real. He knew it had been real. And somewhere, on the other side of the war, there was a German pilot who knew it too. The war ground on. Winter turned to spring. Spring to summer. D-Day came and went. The Allies pushed into France, then Belgium, then Germany itself. And with every mile gained, with every city liberated, the end grew closer. Brown kept flying. Kept surviving. Some days he wondered if that was a blessing or a curse. So many good men gone. Why him? Why did he get to live when they didn't? But he kept going. Because that's what you did. You kept going until the war ended or you died. Those were the only two options. V-Day. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Brown stood in a crowd of airmen in London, watching the celebrations, listening to the cheering, and felt nothing. Just emptiness. Just exhaustion that went down to his bones. It was over. He'd survived. Against all odds, against all reason, he made it through. He went home to Kansas. To blue skies empty of fighters and ground that didn't shake with bombs. He got a job. Got married. Not to marry, she'd married someone else while he was gone, but to a quiet girl named Alice who worked at the library. They had children. Built a life. He taught his son to fly a small Cessna, showed his daughter how to identify clouds. But he never forgot that December sky. Never forgot the German pilot who'd let him live. Sometimes, late at night, he'd tell Alice about it. She'd listen quietly, holding his hand, letting him talk through the memory one more time. She never said she didn't believe him. But he could see the doubt in her eyes. How could she understand? She'd never been there. Never felt the weight of that moment. Years passed. Decades. Brown got older, slower, softer. Retired from his job at the aerospace company. Watched his children have children. Moved to Florida for the warm weather and the golf courses. Life was good. Life was peaceful. But always, in the back of his mind, was that question. Who was he? In 1989, Charlie Brown was 67 years old, and sitting in his den in Miami when he saw the newsletter. It was from a World War II veterans organization, one of the many he joined over the years. Most of the time these newsletters were full of reunion notices and obituaries, reminders that his generation was fading away, that soon there'd be no one left who remembered. But this issue had something different. A section in the back for inquiries. People looking for old squadron mates, trying to find witnesses to events that had haunted them for decades, seeking closure. Brown stared at it for a long time. Then he got out a piece of paper and started to write. He wrote and rewrote the message a dozen times. How did you put something like this into words? How did you explain the inexplicable? How did you find one man among millions who'd fought in the war? But he had to try. After 46 years, he had to try. Finally, he wrote. To the Luftwaffe pilot who escorted a damaged B-17 over Germany on December 20, 1943. I was the pilot of that plane. I don't know your name or your squadron, but I remember what you did. You flew beside us when you could have shot us down. You protected us from your own flak batteries. You waved at me through the broken glass. If you're out there, if you survived the war, I'd like to thank you. You saved my life and the lives of my crew. We made it home because of you. Charlie Brown, Lieutenant Colonel USAF, Ret, Miami, Florida. He mailed it. Then he waited. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Brown began to think it was hopeless. The pilot was probably dead, killed in the last desperate months of the war, or by time, or by any of the thousand things that claimed men after wars. And even if he was alive, what were the odds he'd see this one message in this one newsletter? But Brown kept checking his mailbox. Kept hoping. 6 months later, on a humid July evening, the phone rang. Brown almost didn't answer. It was late, past dinner time, and he and Alice were watching television. Some show he wasn't really paying attention to. But something, instinct, fate, whatever you wanted to call it, made him pick up the receiver. Hello? Is this Charles Brown? The B-17 pilot? The voice was male, elderly, with a distinct German accent. Brown's heart stopped. Started again too fast. Yes. Yes, this is Charlie Brown. My name is Franz Stigler. I think I am the pilot you are looking for. The world stopped turning. Brown couldn't breathe. Couldn't speak. The phone felt impossibly heavy in his hand, and he had to sit down before his legs gave out. Alice looked at him, concerned, but he waved her off. Are you? He had to stop, clear his throat, start again. Are you sure? It was December 20th, 1943. Over Germany. The bomber was shot to pieces. Franz interrupted softly. I could see inside. Your nose was gone. I could see your men, see them bleeding, see them trying to survive. And I thought, I cannot kill these men. They are already dead if I leave them. So I stayed. Brown closed his eyes. Tears were streaming down his face, and he didn't care. It was you. It was really you. Yes. It was me. They talked for 3 hours that first night. Franz told his story, how he'd been refueling at a forward airfield when he got the call that bombers were heading home. How he'd scrambled his Bf-109 and spotted the crippled B-17. How he'd approached for what should have been an easy kill, the final victory that would earn him the Knight's Cross. But then he'd gotten close enough to see inside. Your men were so young, Franz said, his voice thick with emotion. I saw one boy, he couldn't have been 20, trying to hold a bandage to another man's wound. And I saw you in the cockpit, fighting to keep that bomber in the air. And I remembered my brother, Werner. He died on the Eastern Front. He was a pilot too. And I thought, what if someone had shown him mercy? Franz had been an ace. 27 kills to his name by that point in the war. He'd flown since 1940, survived the Battle of Britain, fought over North Africa and the Mediterranean. He'd seen friends die. Had killed men himself, not proudly, but efficiently because that was his job. But he'd also had a commander early in the war, a man named Gustav Rodel, who told him something he never forgot. Honor is everything. You fight with honor or you don't fight at all. If you ever shoot at a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself. That day, looking at the shattered B-17, Franz had seen men in parachutes. Metaphorically. Men who couldn't fight back. Men who were helpless. And he'd made a choice. I flew beside you, Franz told Brown over the phone, his voice distant with memory. I made the flak batteries think you were my prisoner, that I was escorting you to land. I waved off other fighters. And when we reached the coast, I wanted you to know that not all of us were monsters. That some of us still believed in honor. So I saluted you. I saluted back, Brown whispered. I know. I saw. There was a long silence on the line. Finally, Brown asked the question that had haunted him for nearly half a century. Why didn't you come forward after the war? Why didn't you try to find us? Franz laughed, but there was no humor in it. Come forward? To whom? The Americans would have arrested me as a war criminal. The Germans would have called me a traitor. And who would have believed such a story? No, it was better to be silent. To keep it as a memory. Something I did that was right in a war where so much was wrong. Where are you now? Brown asked. Vancouver, Canada. I immigrated in 1953. Started over. New country, new life. I'm a businessman now, was a businessman. Retired like you? I'm in Miami. Yes, I know. From your message. Another pause. Then Brown said, I'd like to meet you. If you'd want to. Franz's voice broke. I would want that very much, Charlie. Very much. They arranged to meet 6 months later. Franz would fly to Seattle, and Brown would drive up from Florida. They picked a hotel near the Seattle-Tacoma Airport, neutral ground, a place where two old enemies could become something else. Brown didn't tell anyone except Alice. Not his children. Not his veteran friends. He wasn't sure why, maybe because he was afraid it wouldn't be real, that he'd get there and Franz wouldn't show up, or it would be the wrong man, or the whole thing would somehow fall apart. Better to keep it quiet. Better to protect himself from disappointment. The drive from Florida to Washington took him 5 days. He wasn't in any hurry. He stopped at roadside motels, ate at diners, watched the landscape change from palm trees to pine forests. And with every mile, the anticipation built. After 46 years, he was finally going to meet the man who'd saved his life. He arrived at the hotel on a gray February morning. The Pacific Northwest was living up to its reputation: cold rain, low clouds, mist hanging over everything. Brown parked his car and sat for a moment, trying to calm his racing heart. What would he say? What would Franz say? Would they even recognize each other? He walked into the lobby. It was modern, all glass and chrome, with a fountain in the center and abstract art on the walls. A few business travelers sat in the chairs, reading newspapers or working on laptops. And standing by the windows, looking out at the rain, was an old man. Tall. Distinguished. White hair neatly combed. Wearing a dark suit and tie. He had his hands clasped behind his back, standing at attention even in repose, and there was something about him, a bearing, a presence, that spoke of a military background. Brown knew. Instantly, certainly, he knew. Franz? The man turned. His face was weathered, lined with age and experience. His eyes were pale blue, almost gray. And when those eyes met Brown's, they widened with recognition. Charlie! They stood there for a moment, 10 feet apart, two old men who'd once been young warriors. The lobby continued around them, people checking in, luggage carts rolling past, the fountain splashing, but they were separate from all of it, existing in their own bubble of time. Then Franz stepped forward. Extended his hand. Brown took it. The handshake was firm, warm. Franz's hand was slightly larger than his, the fingers calloused even after decades away from a control stick. It's really you, Brown said, his voice shaking. It's really me. And then, without planning it, without thinking about it, they embraced. Two strangers who were brothers. Two enemies who were friends. They held each other, and both men were crying, tears streaming down their weathered faces, and neither cared who saw. Thank you, Brown whispered against Franz's shoulder. Thank you for my life. Thank you for my crew. Thank you for... No, Franz interrupted, pulling back to look at Brown's face. Thank you? For giving me a chance to be human in an inhuman war. For letting me make one choice that was right. You gave me that gift, Charlie. You let me be more than just a killer. They sat in the hotel restaurant for hours, ordering coffee they barely touched, talking about everything. The war. Their lives after. Their families. Franz's daughter was a doctor in Toronto. Brown's son was an engineer in California. They'd both lost wives to cancer. They'd both struggled with nightmares for years after the war, different nightmares, but nightmares nonetheless. Franz told Brown about the rest of that day in 1943. How he'd landed back at his base and said nothing about letting the bomber go. How his commanding officer had asked him about the kill, and Franz had lied, said the bomber was already going down when he found it, not worth the ammunition. How he'd lived with that lie for the rest of the war. Brown told Franz about the debriefing, about how no one believed him. How he'd stopped trying to convince people after a while, because it was easier to let them think he was mistaken than to keep fighting for a truth no one wanted to hear. "I thought about you often," Franz said. "Wondered if you made it all the way home. Wondered if your men survived. I hoped, I prayed, even though I'm not a religious man, that you made it. 9 of us walked away from that landing," Brown said. "We lost Frenchy, our tail gunner. He was dead before we crossed the coast. But the rest, we all survived. Blackie lost some function in his arm, but he lived. Spence had nightmares for years, but he lived. Because of you, they lived." Franz looked away, blinking rapidly. "I'm glad. I'm so glad." They talked about the war itself. The madness of it. The waste. Franz told Brown about the friends he'd lost, pilots who'd been like brothers, shot down over England or Russia or the Mediterranean. Brown told Franz about the crews that hadn't come back, the empty bunks in the barracks, the way you learn not to get too close to anyone because they might be dead tomorrow. "I stopped believing in the cause pretty early," Franz admitted. "Maybe 1942, maybe 43. But I kept flying because, what else could I do? Desert? Get shot as a traitor? And my skills meant that other pilots, younger pilots, didn't have to fly the worst missions. I could protect them in a way. Keep them alive a little longer. I kept flying because I was good at it," Brown said. "And because someone had to. But every mission, I wondered if this would be the one. If this would be the day I didn't come home. The day I let you go," Franz said quietly. "I knew I was giving up the Knight's Cross. One more kill and it would have been mine. But when I saw your men, I couldn't do it. I thought of something my old commander told me: you are a fighter pilot first, and a knight second. But you are a human being above all. I chose to be a human being that day. The world needs more choices like that," Brown said. "Yes. Yes, it does." They met again 6 months later. And 6 months after that. The meetings became regular. Twice a year, they'd find a city somewhere between Vancouver and Miami and spend a weekend together. Sometimes they'd go to air shows, walking among the restored warbirds, pointing out details to each other, remembering what it was like to fly those machines in combat. Sometimes they'd just sit in hotel rooms or parks, talking. They became inseparable, in a way. 2 pieces of a puzzle that had been separated for decades, finally fitted back together. Franz's daughter met Brown and called him Uncle Charlie. Brown's son met Franz and said, "So you're the man who saved my dad?" "Your dad saved himself," Franz had replied. "I just gave him a chance." The years passed. They grew older together, these 2 men who'd been young once, who'd fought in the biggest war the world had ever seen, who'd met in the sky over Germany when they should have been trying to kill each other. They started giving talks together. Schools would invite them, veterans organizations, historical societies. They'd stand on stage, Brown in his American uniform, Franz in civilian clothes. He refused to wear his Luftwaffe uniform, said that part of his life was done, and tell their story. Tell how 2 enemies had found humanity in the midst of inhumanity. The audiences were always silent when they finished. Sometimes people would applaud. Sometimes they'd just sit there, processing. Once, at a high school in Oregon, a student asked Franz, "Do you regret letting him go? Don't you wish you'd gotten the Knight's Cross?" Franz had looked at Brown, sitting beside him, and smiled. "I got something better than the Knight's Cross. I got a friend. I got to look at myself in the mirror for 50 years and know that I made the right choice. That's worth more than any medal." Another time, at a veterans conference, someone asked Brown, "How did you forgive him? He was the enemy. His side killed your friends." Brown had thought about that for a long moment. Then he'd said, "I never had to forgive him. He never did anything to me that needed forgiving. He saved my life. He showed me that even in war, even when everything says you should hate, you can choose differently. I don't see a German when I look at him. I see my brother." In 2008, Franz got sick. Cancer, aggressive and fast-moving. He called Brown from his hospital bed in Vancouver. "I don't have long," Franz said, his voice weak but still steady. "Maybe weeks. Maybe days." Brown was in his car 30 minutes later, driving north. He barely stopped, pushing through exhaustion and the ache in his joints that came with being 86 years old. He made it to Vancouver in 2 days. Franz was in a private room, hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed. He looked small in the hospital bed, diminished in a way that Brown had never seen before. But when Franz saw Brown walk through the door, his face lit up. "Charlie! You came!" "Of course I came." Brown pulled a chair close to the bed. Took Franz's hand. The skin was papery, thin, but the grip was still firm. "I wanted to see you one more time," Franz said. To say thank you. For finding me. For giving me these years. For being my friend." "Don't," Brown said, his voice breaking. "Don't say goodbye yet. We have to say it sometime." They sat together in silence for a while. Outside the window, Vancouver sparkled in the spring sunshine. Inside, 2 old men held hands and remembered the sky over Germany, the frozen December afternoon when they'd met as enemies and parted as something more. "Do you believe in heaven?" Franz asked suddenly. Brown thought about it. "I don't know. Maybe." "Why?" "Because if there is a heaven, I hope they let warriors in. Even warriors who did terrible things. I hope there's a place for us. If there is, we'll be there together," Brown said. "You and me and all the other fools who thought war was glorious until we saw what it really was." Franz smiled weakly. "That sounds nice." Franz died 3 days later, with his daughter at his bedside. Brown had stepped out to get coffee, and when he came back, Franz was gone. He'd slipped away quietly, peacefully, in his sleep. Brown stood by the bed for a long time, looking at his friend's face. Franz looked younger in death, the lines of pain and age smoothed away. He looked like he might have looked in 1943, when he was a young ace flying over Germany, before the war had taken its toll. "Goodbye, brother," Brown whispered. "Clear skies." He flew home to Miami and tried to go back to his life. But it felt empty now, incomplete. Franz had been the last link to that day, to that moment, to the thing that had defined both their lives. And now he was gone. Brown started writing it all down. The mission. The attack. The Messerschmitt that had appeared from nowhere. The escort to the coast. The salute. And then the years after, the search, the reunion, the friendship. He wrote it in a spiral notebook at his kitchen table, his handwriting shaky but determined. When he finished, he had 200 pages. He gave it to his son. "This is what happened," Brown said. "This is the true story. Promise me you'll share it. Promise me people will know what Franz did." "I promise, Dad." The story got out. First in veterans' magazines, then in newspapers, then on television. It spread across the internet, this tale of 2 warriors who'd chosen humanity over hatred. People called it the most remarkable story to come out of World War II. Called it proof that even in the darkest times, goodness could survive. Brown did interviews, appeared on talk shows, told the story over and over. And every time, he ended the same way. "Franz Stigler was the best man I ever knew. He was a better man than I am. Because when it mattered, when everything said to kill, he chose mercy. That's real courage. That's real strength." Charlie Brown died 8 months after Franz, in November 2008. The doctor said it was heart failure, but his son thought it was simpler than that. His dad had lost his brother, and he'd lost the will to keep fighting. They buried Brown with military honors at a cemetery in Florida. His son gave the eulogy, telling the story one more time, the story of a bomber and a fighter, of 2 young men who'd met in the sky and changed each other's lives forever. At the funeral, someone placed a photograph on the casket. It showed 2 old men standing together at an air show, arms around each other's shoulders, both grinning like kids. One was wearing an American flag pin. The other wore nothing that marked him as German, just a simple suit and tie. But if you looked closely at their faces, you could see the resemblance. Not in features or coloring, but in something deeper. They had the same eyes. The same expression. The same look of men who'd seen the worst the world had to offer and had chosen, against all odds, to believe in the best. The story didn't end with their deaths. Books were written. Documentaries were made. Their encounter was studied in military academies as an example of honor in combat. Schools taught it as a lesson about choosing compassion over cruelty. But the real legacy was simpler. Two men had met in the sky over Germany on a frozen December afternoon. By every law of war, every rule of engagement, every expectation and assumption, one should have killed the other. But he didn't. He saw a human being instead of an enemy. He saw wounded boys instead of a target. And he made a choice that echoed across decades, that touched thousands of lives, that proved something essential about human nature. We can choose. Even when everything says we can't, even when the world demands we do terrible things, even when the cost of mercy is higher than the cost of cruelty, we can still choose. Franz Stigler chose. And in choosing, he saved not just 10 men on a bomber, but something more valuable, proof that humanity can survive even in humanity's darkest hour. The sky remembers. In the clouds over the North Sea, in the cold wind at 20,000 feet, in the silence between heartbeats when a warrior must decide what kind of man he wants to be, the sky remembers. It remembers a young German pilot who gave up glory for honor, who traded a medal for a soul, who looked at his enemy and saw a brother. It remembers a young American pilot who survived against all odds, who never forgot the mercy he was shown, who spent half a century searching for the man who'd let him live. And it remembers the moment they found each other again, two old men crying in a hotel lobby, proving that some bonds transcend war and time and nationality. The sky remembers, even when we forget. And in remembering, it whispers a truth that every generation needs to hear, that every warrior needs to know, that every person who's ever been told to hate needs to understand. We are all brothers under the sky. All of us. Every single one. The uniforms don't matter. The flags don't matter. The causes and the ideologies and the boundaries drawn on maps, none of it matters as much as the simple, profound, essential fact of our shared humanity. Franz Stigler knew this. Charlie Brown learned it. And together they spent the last years of their lives trying to teach it to a world that desperately needs to hear it. Some stories are about victory. Some are about defeat. This story is about something rarer and more precious. The moment when enemies stop being enemies and become simply men, flawed and frightened and trying their best to navigate an impossible situation. That moment exists for all of us. Not in the sky over Germany, perhaps, but in our own lives, in our own conflicts, in our own choices between hatred and understanding, between vengeance and mercy, between seeing others as enemies or seeing them as what they truly are, fellow travelers on this difficult journey we call life. The question is, when that moment comes, what will we choose? Franz chose mercy. Charlie chose gratitude. Together, they chose friendship. And in making those choices, they became something greater than warriors, greater than enemies, greater than nations or ideologies. They became proof that hope survives. That goodness endures. That humanity, battered and wounded and seemingly defeated, always finds a way to rise again. The war ended 79 years ago. The warriors are mostly gone now, claimed by time what battle couldn't claim. But the story remains. Passed down. Retold. Remembered. Because some stories need to be told. Need to be preserved. Need to be whispered from one generation to the next as a reminder of what we can be when we're at our best. This is one of those stories. Two men. One German, one American. Meeting in the sky over Germany on a winter afternoon when they should have been trying to kill each other. And choosing something different. Something better. Something that echoed across the decades and proved that even in the midst of the 20th century's greatest nightmare, in the heart of a war that killed 60 million people, in the cockpit of fighters and bombers designed for nothing but destruction, even there, even then, humanity survived. Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown. Two names that should have been forgotten, lost in the millions of men who fought and died in World War II. But they're not forgotten. They're remembered. Celebrated. Held up as proof of what we can be when we remember that we're all human, all fragile, all trying to get home. And somewhere, in whatever lies beyond this life, two old pilots are flying together again. Not as enemies. Not even as friends. As brothers. Clear skies, Franz? Clear skies, Charlie? May you both rest in the peace you earned, in the sky you loved, in the brotherhood you proved was possible.